This evening, I've got Rachel on from Australia, and I've just finished watching testimonies given by her and her brother on YouTube, and this story is absolutely horrific. Dad was a prolific serial killer, but much more. He worked for the intelligence agency as a wiretapper. He was linked to a cult, the Freemasons, paedophile rings, hundreds of kids going missing over the years, and Rachel being ignored, and the police, at the very least, being inept, but at the very most, possibly being involved in cover-ups. So, Rachel, do you want to just tell us a little bit about you then, and we can get to how this story came about?
All right, so I grew up in Edwardstown in Adelaide of South Australia. I was born in 1973. I had 5 older siblings, 1 younger sibling that I didn't meet until 2012. My older siblings, of those, the eldest, Claire, deceased the day after she received a compensation payout, which is an unusual time for someone to supposedly take their life, but that's what the coroner has assumed. And poor Claire, she was saying that someone was trying to kill her for a couple of months before she died, but the coroner won't look into it, so we've lost 1 sibling. My 2 older half-siblings, Ruth and Andrew, corroborate my allegations that our father, Alan Maxwell McIntyre, was a serial pedophile, and that they also were witness to dead bodies, murders and body disposals. So they are 18 and 19 years older than me, respectively. And so their witness experiences were in the 50s and 60s, whereas mine were in the 70s and 80s. They were also peddled off to our father's friends. My abuse included satanic ritual abuse as well, so there were those elements also. The reason I wanted to speak with you, Sean, was basically because my brother, as you would have seen in his testimony to the International Tribunal for Natural Justice, was used in child porn. I was as well, but with the particular children that Andrew was used with, they had English accents, and Andrew and I are quite sure that some of these children were the UK stolen generation. Now, there were, by different reports, 130 to 150,000 children sent to Australia for labour camps and to be abused by church clergy and used in child pornography, obviously. And the reason why I wanted to reach out to you and your audience was so that we can put some pressure on from your way to the South Australian government to force them to investigate, because they will not do anything. And myself and my 2 older siblings have been pressuring for the last 14 years. There are 2 properties that my father owned, one in Edwardstown and one in Stansbury on the Yorke Peninsula. Neither of those have been investigated, and it's, I saw children buried at the Macklem Street property. Ruth and Andrew, my older siblings who corroborate me, they saw the Beaumont children. Ruth saw the Beaumont children. There are 3 children who went missing from Fennell Beach in 1966. It's a very big case. Ruth saw them deceased in the boot of a car. Our father corroborated their allegation in 2015 to an investigative journalist called Brian Litley. And he said that, a guy called Anthony Munro brought the children to our property in the boot of a car.
Before we get to that, could you give us the background of your father? And I'd just like to say also,
Sure.
It's the same here. We've got a record number of women in prison for not paying their BBC TV licenses, which cost the taxpayers £50,000 a year to house that person. And the police, the government, are saying they don't have the money to investigate political paedophiles. It's completely upside down. But yeah, your story is so horrendous. But for people to understand it better, could you describe your father, his background, and what it was like growing up with him, and when you first became aware of what was going on?
Okay, so my father was born in 1929. We come from a long line of Freemasons. His grandfather, my great-grandfather, Joseph Wright, was the head of the Freemasons. I'm still unsure whether or not it was the Australian or South Australian or even just the Edwardstown chapter, but he was the head of something rather large in the Freemasons. My father grew up with a range of a large number of siblings. Apparently there was quite a bit of abuse in his childhood. There's certainly been talk that he abused one of his siblings. He worked for Telecom, which is the telecommunications department in Australia. It's now called Telstra. He was a wiretapper. He used to brag about being an ASIO. Well, basically, he said he was a spy to me when I was a child. But he's since written letters to Major Crime Detective in particular, where he says he was an ASIO operative and whistleblower to the federal police. So basically, he had access through the exchanges, telecom exchanges. He had access to everybody's phone calls. He worked as he had so many different jobs. He worked as a grave digger for many years. He worked at Telecom. He had access to a large number of people, most of them, normal, ordinary people, but a lot of them very high-ranking people, including politicians, police. Was abused by a police officer friend of his, which was a chief inspector of police during the time he was abusing me, and doctors in particular. And the doctors were allowed to experiment on us children. So my father would just quite happily hand us over for those experiments. So my first memory of being experimented on was when I was still in nappies. I was probably about 2. I wrote to the Mulligan Inquiry about that abuse. I remember my father's little surgical tool fold-up sort of wrap he had, and he would roll them out. And I even drew the surgical tools that he would use. He wanted to be a surgeon, so his doctor friends would teach him surgical techniques, and he used them on his victims. He was also a Luciferian, a Rosicrucian, and a Freemason. So all of those 3 things combined, and he was also a member of the Golden Dawn. So for him, Aleister Crowley was God. And so one of the tenets of Aleister Crowley was to do what thou wilt. If it feels good, do it. Just go for it. And that was basically what his cult did. Now that cult has been dubbed the Family by local media here. The Family's well known, well covered by media, but usually only in a fear-mongering sense to put fear into the population. They've never been properly investigated. There was an inquiry here, the Mulligan Inquiry, which ran from 2007 onward, and it investigated the missing children. 600 missing children were identified in the Mulligan Inquiry. 106 of those went missing from the Glandore Boys' Home, just 2 streets from where I grew up in Edwardstown. We also know that there were 4,000 UK children sent here, and only 2,000 are left. So my brother, as you would have seen in his testimony to the ITNJ, had a period between 1960 and 1965, this is my brother Andrew, where he had to incinerate packages that were wrapped in butcher's paper. And between 1960 and 1965, he estimates at least 1, possibly 2 of these loads of packages would have to be incinerated in our backyard incinerator every week for those 5 years. So we estimate around about 300 of these cadavers. So basically, the cat got into the incinerator at one point. It was Andrew's job to burn them. The cat got into the incinerator and opened up one of the packages, or several of the packages, and Andrew recognised that, like human bones, he's a hunter back then and still is now, so he got the packages out and assembled what appeared to him to be a human skeleton, obviously not an animal. And the way that the bones had been cut was like the way a butcher would cut things, and obviously they were all wrapped in butcher's paper. Now, this all correlates with stories my father told me, that there was a particular butcher close by to our home that he said sold human meat. There was also a bakery involved with that butcher very close by, and he used to make jokes when we went past if he was in that mood. He had several altars, so he was a very strange man. He would make these sort of nursery rhyme type sing-song statements like, I'll grind their bones to make my bread, insinuating that the bones of the children were ground up for the bread from the bakery, or that they put little boys and girls in the pies and pasties from that bakery. He also showed me that there was a particular emblem on the butcher called a King K that is still used as the logo now on that particular butcher. And the King K was a message to other cannibals that they could get their particular meat from that butcher. So, I mean, this is well outside the realms of most people's normal existence and normal childhood. It's just what we grew up with.
And in these cases, often they prey on the most vulnerable children in society, children in foster homes. Where was he accessing the children from?
So it was a combination of children from the cult. So according to the cult's tenet, each cult member would give up their eldest child or their firstborn to the cult. So that could mean a range of different things. It could mean sacrifice as baby or older. It could mean you were mentored into a particular area. So I was mentored. I was supposed to be a psychologist. I was basically mentored into a Bachelor of Science degree, which I had no science studies, no science subjects in year 12, no chance of getting into a Bachelor of Science degree, but because of who knew, I was put into a science degree. And I've got my year 12 certificate on my Facebook site. I've got my transcript from my first year at Bachelor of Science to show the disparity. It's not possible for me to have got in, but I got in because of who he knew. And he was providing human cadavers and human body parts to both the Flinders and Adelaide medical centres, the two main medical centres in Adelaide. And so he had good friends there. Oh, train of thought. Where was I going with that?
It's okay. So some people who are watching this right now are thinking, wow, this is so out of anything that I could possibly imagine. What proof does she have? Now, you have an injury. I remember one of the testimonies I listened to, there's an injury that you sustained as a kid that was verified that had to, could you describe that?
So part of the cult's tenet again was this belief that if you sever the vasovagal nerve, which is located within the rectum, that you can open the child up to psychic ability. And this is a Freemason belief as well. So that seems to be particular. He used a cult knife. So it's like a bowline knife. It's a curved blade knife to do this ritual abuse. Now, I've had so many people come forward to me in Adelaide who've had the same abuse as children. It seems to be Adelaide specific, but it is a Freemason belief that if you do this to a child before they turn the age of 3, you open them up psychically. I do have a medical report from a professor of proctology proving that did occur to me. I have other medical reports as well which indicate that I was being experimented on by certain local doctors who had access to kuru cadavers or kuru infected cadavers from Papua New Guinea. So that has all been collated and is currently part of a victim of crime application with the Crown Solicitor's Office. The amount of evidence that I've amassed is quite considerable. And that includes psychiatric assessments which show that I'm not schizophrenic or delusional or anything along those lines, quite sane, despite what I've been through. I do suffer from PTSD, but, I'm still a functioning person. And so is my older brother and sister. They still function reasonably normally. I know that they're very stressed out at times, especially when you can't get these things investigated, but we're all fully functional human beings. We're still, coping and getting along. It's just, you sort of have to. It's no point sort of feeling sorry for yourself. You've got to keep moving, keep acting.
So your dad managed to get away with this. He died, but there were numerous co-conspirators. What was the status of police involvement over the years? Was anybody ever arrested, questioned, prosecuted? Co-conspirators, parts of the paedophile network?
Yeah, okay. So my brother, Andrew, managed to get one of his main abusers, Anthony Munro, convicted. So Anthony Munro is still in jail. He's actually on his 3rd conviction for child sex abuse now. So Andrew has great credibility because he managed to get that done. That, mind you, that took the 3 of us campaigning for that. I started writing about Anthony Munro to the police in 2006. I wrote to Denzel Clark of a particular pedophile task force, Argus, in Queensland in 2006 regarding this. Now, interestingly, I was told that they don't interfere with South Australian cases, but they've collaborated with another South Australian case since then, so I don't know what the deal is there. It just seems every time we get anywhere. So basically, Munro is in jail. There is a vast network of these pedophiles. Some are still operating. I know.
In relation to your dad, What was their relationship with his relationship with Monroe?
Very close. So I didn't have much to do with Monroe, but according to Ruth and Andrew, Monroe was only young when he met my father. So he's 20 odd years younger than my father, or if not more. They both, Ruth and Andrew both believed that Monroe was sort of made a psychopath by our father. But I think my father probably just recognised certain traits in Monroe and then took him under his wing, so to speak. Monroe also, I don't believe he had a father figure around him. So what you were saying before about vulnerable children, absolutely 100%. And my father used to foster relationships with the local kids in the area that didn't have a strong fatherly presence.
Is Monroe the one that your dad found your brother naked in bed with?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. But he didn't make a scene. What father does that? That's just amazing. No, he didn't make a scene. So
how old was your brother at that point?
I believe. See, this is the weird part. My brother said that didn't happen. It didn't actually happen. This is just what my father said. So my father put himself in a very stupid position by admitting to that when it didn't happen, and he did a lot of very strange things like that. Very, very weird. I think that the Ultra factor, I really do believe my father was an MK Ultra victim himself, simply because he had these Ultra parts. 1 minute he'd be fine. The next minute something would snap and he would be grinning at you with this demonic expression and you knew you were in for it. So, he could be quite normal at times. And I think that was the way that he managed to convince people that he was okay. He was just a family man, but he was not.
Bit like Ted Bundy. Okay, so Monroe, the police convicted Monroe. Who else was questioned or investigated?
Okay, so 2 of my abusers were investigated, but because I didn't get an admission from them, nothing happened, but at least they were questioned. So, I've got a great deal of respect for the brevet sergeant who came out to my house to take those allegations. I really appreciated that. My father was being investigated in 2016. And the only reason I got that finally happening after 10 years of making allegations and complaining constantly to various authorities that had authority over police, after 10 years I got to the right Member of Parliament who helped me, and she managed to get an investigation to take place. Now, very conveniently, during that investigation, my father died. So, case closed, no more investigation, all over and done with.
What was the cause of death?
I honestly don't know because we weren't allowed to find out. That was given to my other 2 siblings who own the Stansbury property and are in direct opposition to myself and my 2 older half-siblings. So we weren't allowed to know.
So your father was involved in dissecting people, kids, and also child porn and cannibalism. Could you expand on that?
Okay, so look, my father was a very strange man. So he believed, as a Satanist, Luciferian, he believed that he and his doctor friends were going to bring in the zombie apocalypse. Now, it sounds completely, utterly mental. But he explained to me after he murdered a child in front of me when I was 10, and he tried to make me complicit in that murder by placing the knife in my left hand. I'm right-handed, put it in my left hand, put both his hands around my hand and forced the knife into this poor child. After he'd done that and then dissected her in front of me, and I gave all of these allegations to the Major Crime Department in 2012, but then they went after a patsy instead because they preferred to take down a patsy. He then sat me down afterwards and told me that they were trying to bring in the zombie apocalypse as prophesied in the Bible. And of course, everything that my father told me, I had to take with a grain of salt. Then he proceeded to explain to me that I had been infected with these kuru prions from these cadavers that were brought over to Adelaide from Papua New Guinea in the 1970s. And there are particular ways that you would infect a person. I've since discovered through research because I was horrified at the time. I thought, oh my God, because this is the time of AIDS, and he explained that it was a condition that was like AIDS. It would kill me. And I later discovered that the only way to infect a person is either by tissue to brain contact, infected tissue to brain contact, or infected tissue to tonsils, or through a lumbar punch. Well, I was given a lumbar punch at 18 months, and he explained this to me, that this was when the second time I'd been infected. I'd had a long bout of tonsillitis, 6-month bout of tonsillitis from the age of 6 months onwards. So I believe that was probably the first attempt. And I believe that because later, when I was 14, during a forced abortion where I was given a paralytic drug and was fully conscious but unable to move, this doctor then proceeded to sliced open my tonsils and put tissue inside my tonsils. And he actually showed me the tissue as he went in. So that was the way that they tried to infect me. So at age 10, my father explained these things to me. I didn't know he was going to do it again when I was 14. Thankfully, and the reason our family was chosen for this because some of us carry the cystic fibrosis gene, which is a faulty PRNP gene. Now, people with this faulty PRNP gene are susceptible to prion disorders like Lewy body dementia, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. These are all prion disorders, Kuru. So my father forced me to have a genetic test in 2003 because my two closest siblings, two full siblings, are both carriers for cystic fibrosis, and he wanted to see if I was a carrier. I hadn't had children yet, so we couldn't get to find out because they test them here. Test children when they first are born, and my brother and sister had both had their children tested and were carriers, and wanted to know if I was. So in 2003, he paid for a test. It was very unusual for him. It was expensive, and he hadn't given me any money since I left home, apart from $300 to buy a car at one point. So I remember thinking that was really odd that he would really want me to do this test. I had no intention of having children at that point. I was still quite young. So I had the test. He also insisted that I send the test results straight to him, which the doctors wouldn't do because I was an adult. They wouldn't allow that. So the test results came to me. And I am not a carrier for the cystic fibrosis gene. So I don't have that faulty gene. Thank God. Otherwise, I may well be dead by now or suffering these dreadful symptoms. So I think I've somehow, managed to escape that fate.
So you said you were forced to have an abortion at age 14. Did that come about from one of your abusers?
Yeah. So, I always thought it was my father's child because he was abusing me the most frequently. And I had been given drugs, which this purple liquid was very bitter, which a friend has later told me may have been penny wort. Apparently that was a common thing that people were given, but I was given that at age 13. And that I had a dreadful reaction to that. So, I lost the baby and I was dreadfully ill. So he'd already done that to me. Obviously, I don't remember him giving me drugs like that again this time. This time it was a forced abortion.
While all this was going on, where was your mother?
So it's very hard for me to work out whether or not my mother was complicit in these things or not. So a lot of the time I think she was completely oblivious. I would tell her what he was doing to me. She would be incensed until he got home, and then he would do something. So he was quite capable at hypnosis and click his fingers and she'd forget. So there were other times with other people in the cult that would have an effect over my mother so that she would be put into some sort of trance. I would be abused in front of her and she would not notice and then be absolutely surprised and horrified when she'd come out of the trance, and I'd be absolutely despondent. She wouldn't understand why. So there was a combination of her not really being with it. She was drugged quite frequently. There was another time after that child was murdered in front of me when I was 10, I did tell my mother again. She sat me down after a gynecological examination where the doctor didn't even insert anything to find out whether or not I was fully intact, but told me I was fully intact, which I was very angry about afterwards, as you can imagine. She told me afterwards that I had to keep quiet because if I didn't, we would both end up dead or she would end up in jail. So I think she organised that just so that I would, I don't know, believe her over all my personal experiences. I don't know, but that's lots of things happen like that where she would just vacillate between being very protective. And she was a very loving mother. She didn't abuse me, but she would allow me to be abused, I think, out of fear of going to jail. She's very proud. So she did actually sign, and I really do appreciate that she did this. She signed a statutory declaration where she basically sets out that, I was examined at age 4 and the doctor did ask both my parents who were present could I have been sexually abused because I had these dreadful calcified stools stuck up inside my body that couldn't come out. And that was because of my father was abusing me at that point as well. And I remember being terrified because my father was sitting next to me. I just burst into tears. So I thought, my God, the doctor knows and I'm going to end up dead, because my father always told me, you tell anybody, I'll kill you or I'll kill your mother. My mother also said in that statutory declaration that she was present when I was run over by my father, who tried to kill me with his car, unsuccessfully, thank God. And afterwards, this is the weird thing about my mother, after she arrived home to find my father pulling me out from underneath his car, she went off and did the dishes casually while I had to sit on his lap, while he whispered to me about how he wanted to kill me but he couldn't because he loved me too much. And I was 5, nearly 6 at that point. So it's just the most bizarre childhood that you could possibly imagine. But that's, thankfully, well, not thankfully, but my brother and sister, Ruth and Andrew, both had very similar experiences. And I think if I'd had this happen to me on my own and didn't have them to reflect on, I don't know where I would be right now.
Why did it reach the point where he tried to run you over?
He'd been trying to kill me quite a few times. So there's at least 6 times that I remember in my childhood where he tried to kill me. Now, apparently he had just had a big fight with my mother. They'd been at a party together and had this big fight. So, and they were in separate cars. Perhaps it was to freak my mother out, I don't know. I don't remember doing anything in particular or saying anything to anybody in particular at that point for him to do that.
You've mentioned several times about the cult. The abuse occurred in the framework of the cult. And I recently interviewed Wilfred Wong, and he said there sometimes was a ritualistic order of things that were done, and then this person was abused. Was there a ritual surrounding your abuse on those occasions within the cult?
Yeah, absolutely. So one particular abuse happened when I was 14, and I believe it was an initiation of sorts. So I was married off to another cult member, taken to this bizarre resort, Tudor-style resort, Tudor-style houses or buildings, and very, very long table, cult members at one end, and myself and my father and another family member at the other end, and this man acted as our waiter. It was all over me like a rash. I was terribly uncomfortable about it. I was made to wear a special dress that my family member took me out to buy, black and white dress, which was very specific to the Freemasonry light and dark aspects. This guy was all over me like a rash. I was given something in my drink. Next thing I know, we're in one of the outer back buildings, and this bizarre ritual occurred where they all digitally or placed, they either digitally raped me or the men placed their penises inside me, and I was stuck in stirrups. And then afterwards I was married to this waiter. He'd been all over me like a rash. It was just bizarre. And there was a pentagram on the ground. I mean, yeah, this was not unusual. I'd had these experiences before, but that one in particular really astounded me because it took so long. It was such a long evening. Just so many different facets and aspects to it, even to the point where there was a sexton and other masonry symbols on the ground as well. So,
being married to the waiter, was that just in name only at these cult occasions, or did you have to move and live with that guy?
No, thankfully I didn't have to move and live with him. Strangely, I was taken to his home in Victoria when I was about 25. So that was about 11 years later. He certainly wasn't happy to have me there. Didn't want me there. He had a wife at that point, 2 children. I very disturbingly can't remember the end of that evening, so I don't know what happened there, but it was really strange. And again, that was by my father. My father took me to this man's house these 11 years later. And that guy was a writer for a greenie magazine. I still remember his name. Hopefully there'll be something happening with that at some point. But yeah, there's a vast number of these abusers that I can identify. I know their names. Quite a few of them turned up to my father's funeral. I had the forethought to go and film it so that I could then identify the members afterwards. And I've still got that film. I haven't released it, but I will if anything happens to me. So that's been the only real thing I've got to hold on to, that's been shared with certain people and will be released if anything does happen to me. If I'm suicidal, and I have to say I am not suicidal.
So you said this cult was called the Family. Did this cult have people from very powerful positions in society, judges, politicians?
So like I said before, there was one chief inspector of police. The only reason I knew he was a chief inspector of police is because my father told me all about who he was and how important he was. Because according to my father, and I don't know if this is true or not, I've not been able to get any information from South Australian Police about that. But my father told me that this particular chief inspector of police was in the same department responsible for looking for the missing child that this chief inspector of police was filmed abusing with me. And look, the child pornography that my father was producing involved members of Channel 9, one of the stations here. And some of those Channel 9 members have already been, not the ones that abused me, but others have been prosecuted and gone to jail. So it's quite a large ring, the Channel 9 ring.
Are there any names you can mention of people who were prosecuted and have gone to jail?
I believe it was Rick Marshall who worked at Channel 9. I might have the name wrong though. There was a woman called Janet Priest who made allegations about her father. His son worked at Channel 9. I'm not saying that he was a pedophile. I'm just saying that there were connections there. I know that there were quite a few allegations about other Channel 9 employees, but I'm reluctant to name them at this point. I can also say that there was an ex-Attorney General of South Australia who was part of the cult, and I saw this ex-Attorney General commit an atrocity against a baby in the 80s. So very powerful people, very well covered up.
So you said your father was a member of the Family and a member of the Masons. What was the relationship between the cult and the Masons?
From what I could tell, they were one and the same. I certainly didn't see any delineation. I believe they're all part of the same group. In South Australia, the police, their insignia is a checkerboard, so black and white squares, which is the Freemason flooring. It's a very powerful Freemason symbol. So the police here aren't even trying to hide it. That is their insignia. So I believe that was mostly the lower classes were part of the Freemasons and part of the police sort of brigade, whereas the family itself were more the judges. And I know of several judges that were involved, but again, I can't name them for fear of libel. Once they die off, obviously, you have to name them all. There were 922 perpetrators of child sex abuse named in the Mulligan inquiry. Of those, 13 were investigated and 2 were charged.
Could you just, for people in England and America who are not familiar with the Mulligan inquiry, could you just explain what that is?
Sure. Okay. So after decades of people calling out for some sort of investigation into the abuse of state wards in South Australia, and we're talking from the 50s, 60s, we're talking 40, 50 years of allegations made. Finally, in 2007, a Royal Commission Mulligan inquiry was put into place. Unfortunately, and the terms of reference were very, very small. So it was only people who'd been abused in institutions could be investigated. The terms were, it was not just sexual abuse, so not just abuse of children in those institutions, including the church and various other church or religious institutions, as well as St. Vinny's, all the charitable organisations as well. But it was also an inquiry into the large numbers of deaths of children during that period between the 50s and when the inquiry took place, whose death certificates were shown, even though they were children, the death certificates' reasons for death were natural causes. I mean, you can't have that with children. There were approximately 100 children's death certificates that had to be investigated. There were at least 8 deaths that were definitely not natural causes and needed to be investigated further. You cannot find any information about it, though. Although the Mulligan inquiry findings were released, there's an 80-year suppression order on much of the information in there, so you can only get little snippets. And Michael Atkinson, our ex-Attorney General, was the person who signed off to institute that 80-year suppression order. And you've got to wonder, an 80-year suppression order can only service the abusers. It doesn't help anybody else. There was a Senator Heffernan who spoke about this in Parliament, not necessarily the Mulligan inquiry, but about all of the abuses that happened to children and how the suppression orders were there purely to protect the pedophiles. And still nothing was done. He put his life on the line for no reason, really. I believe that the Mulligan inquiry was purely an investigation of all the people who dared to make allegations. And I would really like to see the statistics on how many of those people who came forward to the Mulligan inquiry and professed suicidal thoughts, how many of those then had assisted suicides, because I believe that was the whole point of it, to gather as much information as possible, to get those that were most vulnerable to be shut up.
Did your mother stay with your father until he died? Did your father have other female partners? And if so, did they participate in the abuse as well?
Well, very good question. So my mother left my father when I was 13, left me with him. My sister, closest in age, stayed for about a month and then she left as well, so I was left alone with him. My nieces and my other sister came to live with us for a short period, but it was only a short period. Then he introduced me to what would later be his third wife. I have to be very careful what I say here because was a very powerful woman. She worked at Deakin University. She was head of psychology there. Like I said, I was being mentored into a psychology position. Let's just say I don't like her at all. Very dreadful memories of that woman. I'll put it that way. I also have a number of her cards and letters which really put her in a very bad light. So if I could get some investigation happening, I'm sure that there would be a great deal of interest in those letters because they're replete with MK Ultra trigger words and statements. Do what you like, do what feels good, those sorts of statements. From your wicked stepmama, lots of things like that. So yeah, she clearly didn't see me as a stepdaughter. She saw me as something different.
With the child porn, in one of your testimonies, you described quite a sophisticated operation with the studio, with the professional umbrella-style lights and things like that. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, well, my father had state-of-the-art equipment. So in the 70s, the filming equipment that he had, I don't think anybody else, certainly none of my friends their parents didn't have that sort of filming equipment. I know he had the older stuff in the 50s and 60s when he was filming my brother and sister, but in the 70s and 80s he had video equipment before the video equipment was available, mainstream. I was filmed with 2 high-profile missing children in the 80s. I believe my father was involved with snuff films as well. Apparently a whole cache of these snuff films were left in a box at Channel 9 Studios' door. I don't know whatever happened to them, but there's a long-standing rumour that occurred. The equipment that he had was very impressive. I think that may be part of the reason why none of this has been investigated. I think it's partly because police are being told from higher up that they're not allowed to investigate. Quite often the response I'll get from members of parliament or victim of crime commissioner or or various SAPOL authorities is that it's an operational matter, which is really interesting, that term. So I've been told by some people an operational matter refers to someone or a case where someone's made complaints about police. So it's deemed an operational matter for that reason. In other words, if you make a complaint, it won't be investigated. Other people have told me that it could have to do with Operation Deny, which was an operation that was in force in the 80s. At the same time that over in the UK you had Operation False Flag. And I believe that the whole system in the police at that time was just to completely and utterly deny and shut down anybody who made allegations of this nature.
You see in a lot of these cases that people who work for intelligence, there's like a world where intelligence community and criminals coexist. And because of the work they're doing for intelligence, the criminals are allowed to do the most abhorrent crimes. And when some other kind of agency steps in, the intelligence agency, they have the most power in the land. So they say, look, back off from this guy. He's an intelligence asset, national security here. You guys just leave this guy alone. He's ours. Do you think because of your dad's work as a wiretapper, intelligence, military, that could have been the case as to why he was able to get away with things until he died without serving any prison time?
Yeah, I do believe that, Sean. I do. He often told me that he had immunity from police, immunity from prosecution because of who he knew, and certainly the police couldn't touch him. So he would sometimes say it was because he knew people in high places. Sometimes it was because he thought he was very special. A special friend to police was another term that he used. I mean, it's obvious that he was quite correct. And like I said, he died in a nursing home. Supposedly, I think that we were told it was from dementia that took him, but he was very cognitive 2 years earlier. So it must have been quite rapid onset. Who knows, maybe the career prions finally got him, I'm not sure. He was 88, nearly 89 when he passed. And interestingly, the night that my father passed away, which just coincidentally happened to be my dead sister Claire's birthday, anniversary of her birth, 13th of June, that night, one of my brothers, not Andrew, the other one, decided that he was going to light all these bonfires at the property, Stansbury. And people who were witness to the bonfires said it smelt like burning flesh and hair. So I think, I don't know what was going through his mind. He was interviewed the next day very briefly and he said it was just timber. It didn't smell like timber, according to the journalists who were around the property at that time. And apparently, according to the nursing home nurse who was looking after my father at that time, my father passed. Just before my father passed, he asked that this brother go and see him. The brother went and saw him. My father passed away, and my brother went straight back to the property and lit these fires.
So, hundreds of kids going missing. I'm not familiar with Australian TV. Has there been any programs or coverage of this over the years?
Very little, very little. So you get, with the Beaumont case, there would be coverage every year on the Australia Day, because that's when they went missing. It was a very big high-profile case because there were 3 children missing from the one family, really tragic. It seems to me that became like this money-making exercise for the media and for various writers who've written about the case over and over and over again and made probably quite a substantial profit from it. Anybody who speaks up about the Beaumont children gets absolutely destroyed because apparently we're doing it for money. I've never been paid for any of my interviews and I never will be, and neither have my siblings. But all these writers and the media that make money from it, that's fine. That's fine according to the status quo. Children, there's between 20 and 25,000 children go missing in Australia each year, which is a very high number given we've only got a 27 million population. Only a very small number are ever actually reported about. So you've got your few high-profile cases that will get out in the media, like the Beaumont case, like Richard Kelvin, but the others are just kept quiet. And those poor families can't imagine how hard that must be for them, because they don't even get any coverage. It's like their child just means nothing. For a long time, it was the state wards that were being abused, and cult members' children that they would give up for abuse, and the odd abducted child. Nowadays, it's the Department of Child Protection that takes the children away. So we have a child protection minister in South Australia who has no rights and no power over children. She's an elected official that has absolutely no power, but she's the child protection minister. All her powers were taken away in October of 2018 and given to the chief executive of the Department of Child Protection, Kathy Taylor. During 2019, I wrote a multitude of letters regarding a child that's being abused by at least one of my abusers in the same area where I grew up. So the ring is still operating. Despite everything that I've done to try and expose them, they still operate. And during that time, all of the ministers and all of the people in authority that I wrote to in 2019 did not know or did not inform me that the child protection minister that they were channeling me off to with my allegations and my information no longer had any power. So you know, how can you protect anybody in a state where you don't even have an elected official to look after the children? It's this Department of Child Protection chief executive. And I've written to her on many occasions and never get a response. So it's a horrific situation.
You raised an interesting thing, though. You said that you don't get paid for interviews, and perhaps critics would say there is something motivating you to say these things, like you want to sell a book or you want the attention. But actually, by making these allegations, it's caused a lot of havoc and it's been detrimental to your life. Is that the case?
Oh, yeah, 100%, Sean, 100%. So, I mean, I've been trolled, I've been threatened, I've had a police ombudsman advocate tell me I've been dealt with on 3 times in one conversation in a very menacing way. I've had some pretty terrifying stuff. I guess it's certainly not to make any money. I'm not making any money out of this, and I wouldn't anyway, because as far as I'm concerned, integrity is about still speaking up regardless of the dangers. I probably will write a book at some point, but I'll probably do what Fiona Barnett did and just give it out freely, because what she did was amazing, and she informed and helped an enormous number of people, and that's where I would like to go with it. I'm certainly being asked on a regular basis to do so, but there won't be any money in it, absolutely not. The trolling has been extreme. So Fiona Barnett has a whole series of trolls that have been harassing her for years. She's gone quiet recently, and now they've all transferred their attention to myself and my 2 siblings. So it's proof to me, because Fiona was in New South Wales, her abuse was predominantly there, but the same trolls are attacking myself and siblings who are from South Australia. Now, it's proof to me that the rings were interlocuted, that they're connected very much so. And I know that some of the child pornography that my father was producing and some of the victims were being trafficked over to Victoria. So this is a very convoluted network of pedophiles that have been doing this stuff for decades. I've tried very hard to get the Australian Federal Police involved. They won't get involved unless it's an interstate ring. Given them the proof that it's an interstate ring, they will not become involved at all. They won't help. So when you've gone to, must be at least 90 individuals now of over 20 different authority departments over SAPOL, including the SAPOL departments that I've gone through, when you've gone through everyone you can possibly go through, the only thing that is left is to go through people like yourself to get the message out there. So that's what I've done.
From the Epstein case, we've seen that the brave women who came forward were given the runaround by the police. They let Epstein have the sweetheart deal, and they've really had to fight and struggle over the years to be heard. Now, the victims in the rings you're describing would be adults now. Have any of those adults come forward or contacted you or the police?
Quite a few have contacted me. They are terrified. So there is apart from the fact that my father corroborated my brother and sister in his statement to Brian Litley in 2015, saying that Anthony Munro brought the dead Beaumont children to our Edwardstown property when they went missing. There's another witness that's come forward and said that he actually saw one of the children being murdered and that Anthony Munro was involved with that as well. Now, he went to police 2 years ago. They won't do anything about it. So, it doesn't matter how many witnesses come forward, they still won't investigate. One thing that really needs to be said is that my father's former property at Stansbury on the York Peninsula had a sinkhole. Now, shortly after the children went missing and were seen dead in the boot of the car by my sister, there was some sort of kerfuffle about sheep falling in the sinkhole. Now, supposedly, one of the sheep had fallen in the sinkhole. Mind you, these sheep had lived on the property for years, and all the other sheep had followed them in there. Now, number one, none of the sheep were missing. And so apparently because the sheep had fallen in the sinkhole and there was this dreadful smell, it had to be closed in. Now, Ruth and Andrew, my older siblings, are convinced that the remains of the children are in that sinkhole. And we have been trying so hard for the last several years to have that sinkhole exhumed. Now, our other two siblings who oppose us own that property and would not allow it to be excavated. There are now 13,000 signatures of very angry and very frustrated people on a change petition to have that sinkhole exhumed. And it just doesn't matter how many people come forward and try and force Safehole to do this. They will not look in there. Now, it's very likely the cult was very strange. So the three Beaumont children were murdered, and then 3 children were taken, estate wills were taken from, I believe, Woodwood Orphanage. This is not my time frame, so I hope I'm saying that correctly, from my brother and sister. And they were paraded around Adelaide because they looked like the children. They were picked specifically for that reason. They looked like the Beaumont children, to make it look like the children had survived. Now, they were also murdered, and it's very likely that they are also in the sinkhole. So my father kept treasures, so it would have been his decision to keep them all close, keep them all nearby, so that he could lord it over them and use that as leverage and protection throughout his life. And he kept a lot of treasures. So, that's just one section. There are other treasures at the Macklin Street house that also need to be exhumed. It doesn't seem to matter how much evidence comes forward. The Castalloy factory in North Plympton was dug in 2018, I believe it was, on the allegations of just one person. So you've got one person making vague allegations about a man they dubbed the Satin Man, and an enormous dig took place, and there was a lot of media attention, and it was huge. It cost 250 grand for that dig. Now, they didn't even wear forensic suits when they did the dig because they knew there was nothing there. They found animal bones, but the fast was to keep everybody quiet. And now, because they spent all that money on that dig, they won't dig the Stansbury property. And we're quite happy to crowdfund to get the money for the dig. But my 2 opposing siblings will not allow it to happen. And I think the reason for that is they know that my father was involved in these dreadful crimes, and their pride, or the fact that they allowed him access to their children, even after we've made allegations about him, they allowed him access to their children. They will not allow this to occur because they won't be able to save face. So in the meantime, we just keep getting vilified by those family members.
You said your father had an incinerator. Do you think the majority of the corpses ended up in there?
Yes, I do. But what didn't burn was then dug out from the base of the incinerator and then buried in the backyard, and trees were placed on top. Now, I've had discussions with the new owners at the Macklin Street property where these remains were buried, and they said, there weren't any bones, but they wouldn't be looking for, they wouldn't realise that they were human because they were butchered. They were sliced up, like a butcher would do with a bandsaw. So they wouldn't necessarily recognise that they weren't animal bones. We need someone who's a forensic pathologist to go in there and investigate. We need a proper team. One of the children that I saw buried there in 1983, her burial place was dug up in November last year. So all that evidence is gone. I don't know if they found her bones or didn't find her bones. Even if my father moved her remains, and he may have done that by hooking out her bones from under the corner of the slab of concrete that he put there, there would still be some remains there. But that's all that evidence is lost now. So that poor child, it doesn't matter how much I speak up for her, I can never prove now. Apart from if we can find the footage of myself and her and this chief inspector of police, that would still hopefully be floating around somewhere. But that's the only evidence I'll ever be able to get.
So for the people watching this, Rachel, is there any way they can help you, or is there anything you would like to say to them in conclusion?
Sure. Look, if you do have any information or you want to know about the stolen children, please contact me, Rachel Vaughan, Beaumont Bombshell, on Facebook, or rachel.vaughan73@gmail.com. I welcome anybody to contact me, even if you're just an SRA victim and you want some sort of help there. I might be able to help in that way. And sign the petition if you're in Australia. You can sign the petition. That would help a lot. That's just Google Stansbury petition.
Really appreciate you sharing this information, Rachel. You're a very strong woman. Thank you for spending the time.
Thank you so much, Sean. I really appreciate it.
Cheers.